This information will focus on the New Deal and the American West. So, to begin with, today when we look at especially Western lands on the Great Plains and farmers in it, we tend to view them as a very conservative group of folks. But this is really kind of a newer phenomenon. Late 18th century or late 19th century and early 20th century, this was a place that, first of all, it wasn't the least populated part of the United States. Today when we look at rural areas, we have a lot of small towns dotting the Great Plains in the American West that almost at the point of ghost towns as generations after generation has moved away to urban areas. Back in this time period, you still had towns that today may be largely empty with, downtown or Main Street, as we like to call it, just a bunch of closed shops that still saw a lot of business and, schools that were full. And the farmers that lived in this area, they could get pretty radical. And they were definitely at times radicalized by the events that were happening around them. These were folks that viewed the railroads as having an inordinate amount of control over their day-to-day lives. This was a time period where we were becoming more and more of a globalized marketplace, which could also make you feel as though things were outside of your control. And so you had groups of farmers that would get together and they would agitate and they would strike and they would protest. And you even had some cities that would even go so far as to create communist communes. So it was a very different time period, or a very different society than it really is now. So we're going to start off by taking a look at the 1920s and agrarian unrest. And again, we're really kind of focusing on the New Deal era, although we will be dipping back a little bit into the late 19th century. So we want to start by, this time period by taking a look at the 1920s. What was happening then and why did agrarian unrest start under President Herbert Hoover? So to begin with, again, this was a period in agricultural history where farm protest movements were not new, and in fact, farmers really knew how to organize, and they would take on causes that were considered very progressive for their time period as a way of improving their own lives. And so the very first organization by the farmers in this age was the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, and it was established in 1865. And this provided the base for early 20th century populism. And it grew very quickly. So, it started off small, and then by 1875, you're talking about 850,000 members involved in it in communities throughout the Great Plains and throughout the American South and even northern states. And when it started, it was actually a non-political organization. So example of some of their activities. Women, female members would come together and they'd trade recipes and engage in social activities. Men, would come together to talk politics and discuss agricultural practices. So it was mostly, again, kind of social, if you will, self-improvement, community building, but it did act as an organization that could place pressure on state legislators if it needed to. So it starts there with the Grange, but then from the Grange comes the Farmers Alliance. And it started as a non-political organization in Texas and then spread throughout the Great Plains and beyond. And here they, again, the emphasis was non-political. But it could be, it was meant for economic self-improvement, and so that economic aspect could carry with it political power, political influence. So what was their main focus? First of all, they wanted to start creating cooperative grain elevators, cooperative cotton yards, cooperative stores. These were ways that businesses outside of the Great Plains, outside of the agricultural field, could influence and control farmers' lives. So grain elevators, where farmers took their, it was like the first stage in the supply chain for the farmer. Would take them to the grain elevator, and then the grain elevator owner and operator would basically give them money for their product, their crops, their commodities, that was based on current market prices. Of course, the owner got a commission himself, and so really the farmer just kind of got what was left and hopefully made a profit on that year's crop. Same went true with cotton yards. You had a number of stores, especially in the American South, where these stores would give credit to farmers for seed and for tools for that year's crop. And the farmer, of course, had to take this on debt, take it on debit. And then the hope was that he would have enough money at the end of the year to, pay back the store, as well as have a little bit left over. So by coming together and having farmers own these things, it gave them more control, it gave them a bigger cut of the profit, and it helped them. So these were their main emphasis. This was the main emphasis. But they also included bringing in lecturers to educate farmers on techniques, on cooperatives. They had people that would go throughout the plains and throughout the South, spreading, the farmers' alliances and creating new chapters, new organizations. And by 1889, the Farmers Alliance became very political. After candidates from the Farmers Alliance came together and won overwhelmingly in Kansas elections. One thing about politics in American Western states, especially in the late 19th century, was that they were usually controlled by railroad companies. They were controlled by money that would be donated to politicians by railroads, by large agricultural interests, by large cattle ranchers, mining companies, you name it. And so usually the state legislatures were bought and sold by one interest or another. So by the late 1800s, what's happening here is these farmers' alliances that are born from the Grange are saying, enough with non-political organization. We're putting our own people in office, and it starts in Kansas. And then from there, it goes nationwide. And so by 1891, what happens is that the Populist or People's Party is formally created. And this officially happens in 1892 at the Omaha Convention when James Weaver is nominated for the presidential candidate, and James G. Field as the vice presidential candidate for the Populist Party. It's kind of interesting because Weaver was an ex-Union general and Field was an ex-Confederate officer. So fought on different sides during the Civil War, but now two guys coming together for a common cause. And they adopt what's known as the Omaha Platform. And what does it call for? It calls, first of all, for the secret of the Australian ballot, so no more public ballots where people could trace, what you're voting for. This used to be a means by which employers could control employees' political participation, especially, in larger cities. Called for a graduated income tax. It called for a restriction on immigration, 8-hour workday, the abolition of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, the initiative, referendum, and recall, direct Senate election of senators, and opposed aid to private corporations. So you might wonder, okay, what does the 8-hour workday have to do with a farmer? Don't they work from sunup to sundown? Well, you have to understand that the Omaha Platform, the Populists are realizing that they need labor to come together with agriculture. So agriculture, these are the farmers. Labor, these are the folks that are living in the cities and working in factories. And they're wanting to bring together, kind of the working class of all aspects. So, this is really a big labor issue here. This is a really big labor issue. And so here, farmers are coming together, the ag's kind of pushing for that. Both sides are pushing for these ideas right here. And so it's a fusion of these two interests. And when the election occurs, it's Cleveland as the Democratic candidate. You got Harrison as the Republican, Weaver as the Populist. At the end of the day, Weaver only captures 22 electoral votes and 8.5% of the popular vote. But, you know, consider that in today's context. Today's context, you get the Green Party, the Libertarian Party in American politics. They don't gather much in terms of the popular vote. Here they're closing in on 10%. Populists are. And so we see that this third party is, really kind of working. It's putting pressure and indicating to the Republicans and Democrats that, hey, we have some issues. You're going to want to pay attention to them. And, when you get into the early 1900s, we're going to see another party come out, and they're going to, likewise do the same thing, put pressure on these other parties, and this will be the Socialist Party. For now, it's the Populists. Now, a couple other things about these demands. Pinkerton Detective Agency. If you're not familiar with them, the Pinkerton Detective Agency was an organization that really kind of played a number of different roles. The Pinkertons were actually did the same functions that the Secret Service does today. They were individuals that usually provided security to railroad trains that bandits tried to hold up in the American West. But also they could be used by mining companies and by corporations to come in and to put down labor unrest with an iron fist. So agriculture here, labor here, both of them are coming together and saying, okay, we don't want these guys, performing these functions anymore. Some of the things that, would see success early on right here, initiative, referendum, and recall. Today, voters can still initiate legislation. They can hold a referendum on legislation in many Western states, and they can even recall politicians that have been elected. And, we see this happen with relative frequency in California in today's political climate. Also, direct election of senators. They are going to win a constitutional amendment to get that secured in the near future. So again, if we take a look at the vote here, we can see how it all shakes out. Now, what happens though is in 1892 they realize, okay, they're not getting enough support from labor. They do gain votes and seats in state legislatures, but they don't get much traction at the presidential level. So in 1896 they have another decision to make. And this year, the big question is, okay, do they become a fusion party? Do they fuse with the Democrats? Or do they remain a third party? And there's a big debate within the populists over this. But at the end of the day, they decide to go with the fusion ticket. Within the Democratic Party, you have a big push for the labor vote. The Democrats at this time are still capturing a lot of votes for labor in cities. They do have inroads into the agricultural sector. But the big issue here is really gold, the gold standard. Republicans are still pushing to maintain a gold standard. And what that means is that American currency is backed by gold. And what this usually does when you have a gold standard is that credit tends to be a bit tighter. So if you're somebody that's like lending money, you're going to get back pretty much whatever you're lending out, plus your interest. You're going to make a little bit more money off that. It's better if you're involved in international trading in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But if you're a farmer, you don't really want this because that constricted credit is really going to make it that much more expensive for you to, get the money that you need for your crops and for your equipment. And so what they want is silver to be included in to the backing of currency. And so really this is what sells it. And Williams Jennings Bryan, he emerges as their candidate in 1896 when he gives his famous Cross of Gold speech, saying that the moneyed interests of the East will not crucify the farmers and the laborers and the Americans on their cross of gold. And this was really big. So like today, if you enjoy The Wizard of Oz, The Wizard of Oz, really has a lot of the politics of the time period in it. I mean, it's um, you have the Wicked Witch of the East, for example. The gold interest that's threatening Dorothy and the Munchkins and the others. And yeah, if you go through and you reread it, you see all the symbolism of the politics of this time period in it. So what happens? Well, going into World War One, this was a great time for farmers. I mean, when World War II broke out, you had suddenly a major shortage for grains, for cereals, for all sorts of agricultural product because European men aren't in the fields; they're out fighting the battlefields of France. They're fighting in northern Italy. They're fighting, in the Eastern Front that's constantly pushing deeper and deeper into the Russian Empire, and so that means America had a major boom period. But then what happened is, following World War II, agricultural property, it crashed. So if you look at, say, we're going to put this on a chart. So like this is the 1920s, it's 29 here. Here's post World War II. We'll say post World War One. For the country, it's like if we were just charting prosperity, it's doing this. It's going up, 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 up. For farmers, what happens is, initially afterwards, they still have a bit of this boom, right there for the farmers. But then what happens is all those Europeans come back home and they start planting, and then boom, they're the farmers down there. They're really suffering because they've taken out a lot of loans for new farm equipment during World War One. When they couldn't produce enough to keep up the demand, and now they can't really sell their crops for a good price anymore. So the Roaring '20s were roaring for everybody but farmers. So 1919 to 1920, their prosperity crashes, and it's not really until about 1924 that it starts to gain back up. But by that time, they've already lost all that growth right there. So, what were some other things that happened during this time period that they can count as good things? Okay, well, after about a 4-year hiatus, yes, their prices finally start to regain, and then there are some political gains for them as well. You had the Capper-Volstead Act of 1922. Basically, this provided a number of exemptions for agricultural cooperatives, allowed them to organize better. Kind of helped this self-help tool that farmers had been using for a while. In addition to that, this law also had some sections in there that helped them with the marketing of their crops. This was further boosted in the Cooperative Marketing Act that followed shortly thereafter, which created a division of cooperative marketing in the Department of Agriculture. And this was basically collecting data for farmers, helping them to understand, these cooperatives to understand, when they need to limit production, to help them to control the timing, so that way they weren't putting too much product on the market and sinking their own prices. Help them kind of keep those prices at just the right level that they needed to make a profit. And this was followed even further in 1929 by the Agricultural Marketing Act, and this one created stabilization corporations to again help stabilize prices with cotton, wheat, corn, hogs, a number of commodities, and it also helped them to market their products internationally. But again, you have the negative, farm and cattle prices, they did fall. They never fully recaptured what they were. So, for example, here, Washington wheat prices in 1920 were sitting at $1.83 a bushel. By 1929, it's still only at 83 cents. It gained some of what it lost, but it's a dollar lower than what it had been. In Montana, half the farmers lost land to foreclosure between 1921 and 1925. Wyoming, if you looked at cattle prices, 1919 they had over 1 million head worth $74 million. So 1 million head, $74 million. 1925, 800,000 head. Okay, they shrank by 200,000, but look at this. It's only worth $23 million. I mean, that's a substantial drop in prices. And you can go through and you can just look at debts, and you can look at, land values, and just see that, they were really struggling already in the 1920s. Now, come in behind this, and there was a defeat of a bill that they were really pushing for, and this was the McNary-Hoganism, or the McNary-Hogan bill. And what this bill tried to do is, it was introduced and reintroduced from 1924 to 1928, but it was really kind of pushed by George Peake, and he was the guy that had served on the War Industries Board during World War I. And the War Industries Board was responsible for basically controlling the price of farm commodities. And what they wanted to do was to come in, with this bill and allow the federal government, first of all, to separate agricultural and industrial products when it came to tariffs, so that, you could protect industrial goods, but then agricultural products wouldn't be at risk if a trade war hit. And then another thing that it would allow the Department of Agriculture to do is establish a corporation that could basically come in and shore up commodity prices. So, if the farmers couldn't, limit production, or if they couldn't have a big enough effect on the national market, then the Department of Agriculture would be able to come in with federal funds and purchase up excess supplies, sell them, dump them on the world market, but keep domestic prices and, where it needed to be for farmers to make enough of a profit to keep their livelihoods. And ultimately, this was vetoed by Calvin Coolidge and by Calvin Coolidge, at the suggestion of Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover at the time. So you add to that also Western bank failures because of some of these challenges and other issues. And, again, you had some of these political gains, but you had a lot of economic losses for these folks. So what happens? 1931-32, by 31, we're already a year plus into the Great Depression. The farming sector is going to lag. You're going to have unemployment skyrocketing in cities right off the bat. You're going to have unemployment. You're going to have hardship on the farms. They're going to be a little insulated, but it is going to start to catch up to them by 1931, 1932. So the first round of trouble actually came in the form of the Cow War of 1931 to 32. And it started really with a government program launched to inspect cows of tuberculosis. And what would happen is inspectors would go out and they would, use a test on cattle. And if they gave a cattle a shot underneath the skin and the cow developed a lump, then the cow was put down. And what happened was, the reason why they were doing this is they began to realize that tuberculosis could be spread to human beings through cow milk. And so, the Western states, they're picking up on this law, and they're starting to enforce it. And Iowa was like ground zero for enforcement. So farmers, their cattle are getting tested, If it's found as infected, it's immediately slaughtered. Um, Usually, it's going to be ground up and used for fertilizer. Sometimes the healthy parts of a carcass might actually be sold as meat, but usually what happens is there's going to be what's called a salvage fee of about $38 per animal, and which seems cheap to us today, but it's expensive back then. A third of this was covered by the state, one third covered by the federal government, but here's the kicker: one third of that's covered by the farmer. So not only are they losing a cow, they're also having to pay for the loss of the cow. So what all happens here? Really starts with William Butterbolt of Cedar County in Iowa. His cows, usually what would happen is that the inspector would go out and inject the cow. There's a little period of time, usually like a day, before the lump would form if they're infected. But the farmers would usually go out and like massage the cow. But one of William Butterbrot's cows is found infected. He's resisting the stress. It ends up with standoff between him and the authorities. This gets picked up by this guy named Norman Baker, who runs a paper and a radio show, and by the way, also he was a failed kind of cure-all medicine maker at one point. He's really promoting the cause of William Butterbrot, and it ends up with Governor Dan Turner having to call out the Iowa State Guard, requesting help from the National Guard. Of course, farmers are coming in and they're backing up Butterbrot, and it ends up with a standoff. So you already have this, the cow incident, but in addition to that, communism was really spreading throughout the Great Plains also. You had entire cities that were actually adopting and supporting communism and socialism. So there's an incident where there was a funeral, for example, and a communist Russian flag was actually draped over the coffin at the funeral. And here you have figures like Ella Reeve, Mother Bloor, George Mackey, the United Farmers League that are, pushing communism as a way of the farmer finally, getting a voice and getting security and, bringing voice to the people. And all of this is happening at the same time that all of a sudden the Great Plains is now getting hit by the pains of the Great Depression. And so it's really radicalizing people. And this becomes, fully evident with the Farmers Holiday Association that forms up, and on May 3rd, 1932, under the leadership of Milo Reno. And what the FHA did is they said, okay, we're losing money, we're losing our farms, we have a lot of debt, we don't have the prices. What they wanted to do is they wanted to embrace the idea behind McNary Hoganism and boost up the cost of production. And in this case, what they were going to do is they were going to go on strike. And they were going to prevent the foreclosure of farms. So there's kind of multiple things happening here at the Farmers Holiday. First off, there's what were known as the penny auctions. A lot of farmers are starting to lose their land, and then what would usually happen is the bank would send out a representative, and the representative would hold an auction. And so all the farmers' neighbors would show up whose land is being auctioned, and they would basically stand around any would-be bidders with farming implements and shotguns and whatever else, and you'd have one individual that would bid a penny on the land, and it was pretty well understood that you were probably not going to get very far if you actually made a bid on this property. So usually the bank would end up having to sell it to the indebted farmer at a fraction at most of its value. Another thing that farmers started doing was engaging in the farmer strike, where they would literally block off roads to cities where products were being taken to market. You had farmers that were stopping milk trucks, literally busting them open and dumping the milk out onto the highway. All of these things to create an artificial shortage to bring up the prices. And there were some individuals that attempted to actually, break this attempt, but usually it didn't end very well for them. So, what would be the federal response once the Roosevelt administration came in? Well, basically, they're going to adopt these policies that the farmers want in the form of the Farm Credit Administration and the AAA. So the AAA, for example, what is it going to do? It's going to pay farmers to do what they were actually doing during the farm holiday, which is just not plant, to let their land stay fallow and basically provide a covering, let it rest, let the soil rejuvenate. And the Farm Credit Administration was going to basically help infuse farms with would-be short or low interest loans and other funds. Now this brings us into the Dust Bowl. If it wasn't enough for an economic collapse of the international economy to happen to hit the farmers, they're going to get a double whammy. They're going to be hit not only by economic hardship, but by an environmental catastrophe. What happened to cause the Dust Bowl? We really got to take a look at a few different things. We got to look at the economy. The economy at this time period, really kind of pushed farmers to farm. There wasn't a lot of interest in letting land lay fallow when you could be farming it up. There's an interest in monoculture farming, monocrop farming. You had some farms that were so massive that it took an army of workers just to harvest it. So this kind of accounts for like your economic and your kind of your cultural approaches to the land. And then of course there's the ecology itself. If you take a look at the Great Plains, much of it lies west of the 100th meridian, which is usually kind of considered the traditional dividing line between your subtropical humid environments that provide enough rainfall to grow crops without irrigation, and the semi-arid regions of the United States of America. If you look at the ecology of the Great Plains, in the northern plains, the natural ecology was that you usually had these taller prairie grasses that lived in regions that were usually you would get a more abundant rainfall. And then this would even differ between cool season grasses and warm season grasses that kept ground covering in the Great Plains year round and provided forage for the bison. And the bison would actually travel to western regions during the winter to graze, east during the summer. There was this cycle. Down there in the south you had kind of shorter grasses, but one of the thing about the grasses in the Great Plains is they all usually had these like really deep roots to reach down and get actually to the water, which would allow them to survive the climate of the Great Plains. So the whole wildlife, vegetation, even the humans that existed there had learned to adapt to the ecosystem. And so what basically happens is that when they started to actually settle this part of the country, the Americans that were coming from the eastern lands that were much more humid, they weren't accounting for all this. So they didn't account for the flatness, the arid nature, the treeless nature. You know, one thing about the Great Plains is those that live there will know this, is it's not really the temperature itself during the winters that hits you. It's that wind that just comes screaming out over the Great Plains with nothing to block it, and just, you know, kind of tears that cold right through your system. You know, it's those winds. And this is something that farmers are going to learn intricately about, because what happens is out here on the Great Plains, they adopt a form of agriculture, or a farming method known as dry farming. And the idea behind dry farming is, you know, here's your soil down here. And down here is finally where the water is. You got this really thin layer of, you know, grass right up there. What you do when you dry farm is you basically drill your furrows as deep down as you can. And the idea is to penetrate deep into this moist section. And then at the very top, you basically want to turn the soil here into a dry, almost powdery kind of mulch. The idea is you intermix, you get this moistness, right, this moisture right here, and then this powdery mulch at the very top is going to trap that moisture down there in the soil. This is the idea. And then, of course, all this vegetation up here at the top, that's stripped away in the process. Well, it's great for you know, planting wheat, but what happens in a drought? Well, the grass that was there, it's made for that drought. It's adapted to those times of drought. Wheat, these crops that they're importing into this ecosystem, are not. And so what's going to happen is on this flat, treeless plain, the winds are going to hit, and it's going to basically pick up all that topsoil. And it's you know, droughts are not uncommon for the Great Plains. If you go through here and you take a look at the Great Plains and you take a look at drought levels do occur in almost complete frequency. So up here, what you're looking at, these are going to be your years of heavier rain. Down here, you're looking at years where drought's going to come in. And then what do you have is right here, you're going to have like your filthy 50s. There's your dirty 30s. You know, drought, see, it just keeps on going. And this isn't even the worst of the droughts that have hit the Great Plains. There's actually a period known as the Altithermal period, where you're talking about almost 100-year drought that led to humans and animals being pushed out of the Great Plains. And we believe that this is one of the reasons for the mass migrations and the movement and the conflict that's going to occur, that's going to start to affect the civilizations like the Mississippian cultures and the Anasazi. So farmers didn't know about this. They weren't aware of it. So what's going to happen? Well, the drought starts in the 1930s and it doesn't stop. You know, it's just drought for almost 10 years straight. And all of the Great Plains are affected to it with one degree or another, but the one that's affected most is right down here in this region of the Texas Panhandle, the Oklahoma Panhandle, and this little corner region of Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. But as you can see, it's throughout the Great Plains also. And for farmers, this is going to be a tough time. So what'll basically happen is the winds will start to blow and then they just won't stop. And, you know, it's basically going to turn the Great Plains into a true Great American Desert, worthy of the name that Major Stephen Long gave it back in the 1800s. It's going to cause farmers to go bankrupt. Initially, the farmers are going to, you know, turn to the Red Cross, their churches, their local governments, county governments, but this aid quickly runs out, and so what's going to happen is they're going to have to scrimp and save as much as they possibly can, Women are going to help families get by as much as they can by selling eggs, cream, butter, vegetables, modifying recipes, taking jobs. Some farmers are going to continue to fight and try to stay on there, but then they also have to deal with the mental and physical uh, threats. So, one thing that becomes a common day problem for farmers in this part of the country is silicosis of the lungs. This is basically all that sand and dirt they're sucking in, while they're out there trying to farm, because their idea was whenever dust storms were on the threat of blowing in, you'd go out there and try to plow the field to get that moisture, or up, and put furrows on the ground so that hopefully it'd catch some of that soil, all in vain. So they're out there sucking all that stuff in. Measles, had outbreaks of measles, and then there were suicidal tendency. One Oklahoma man, at one point actually was found getting his shotgun out. He's ready to shoot his family because he said he'd rather them die than suffer. So you're talking about family annihilation in some cases. Now, migration out did happen, but it's not quite as common as people thought. We oftentimes refer to Okies, those people that were migrating west to places like California. Really, Oklahomans weren't the biggest group. Arkansans really were. But by 1935, less than 1 million people had left their farms. It's a lot of people, but it's not like the whole place became depopulated. Followed by another 2.5 million afterwards. Really, only about 400,000 though actually leave. They're only go west. Follow the whole Grapes of Wrath kind of route. Most people, if they left, they migrated to cities. So they just went into the city and tried to find a job there. So what happens? Well, the New Deal comes in, and this is where the federal government completely changes the relationship between the farmer and the federal government. It starts with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, in which they pay farmers not to plant crops, and this is paid for by taxes. You had, in addition to that, drought relief that was included into the AAA livestock slaughtering program. You had the Land Utilization Act project, in which they tried to buy out a bunch of about 11.3 million acres of submarginal lands. And the idea was to basically turn these into national grasslands. Some of our national grasslands, that's where this comes from. And, in an effort to save the Ogallala Aquifer, you still kind of have some groups that continue to push for the reduction of farming and return to grasslands, even today, with varying degrees of success. One big policy, arguably the most successful one, was the Soil Conservation Service. This was actually expanded from the Soil Erosion Service in 1935. But it was funded by Congress. In fact, they say that the bill was passed when an advocate went to Hugh Hammond Bennett went to the to Congress, and he's sitting there arguing before a committee hearing that they needed to pass this legislation, and he knows ahead of time that a dust storm from the Great Plains has hit and it's on its way to Washington, D.C., and so while they're in a committee cert meeting, the sky darkens from all the dirt that's blown in from the middle of the country. And yes, by the way, that dirt would blow from the Great Plains all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And he dramatically stands up and says, "Gentlemen, this gentleman is what I've been talking about," and Congress passes it. What Congress does is they set up a bunch of different experimental stations and worked with colleges like Texas A&M to go out and basically teach farmers how to, conserve the soil. So one way that they did this was by teaching about contour farming. Farm with the contour of the land and leave segments leave segments right here unplowed so that it provides, some erosion protection. Another thing that they did is they pushed for the planting of trees. Used trees as a natural windbreak on the Great Plains. So a lot of things to help out with erosion and both wind and water erosion. So listing, terracing, contour plowing, all of these things. New Deal plans, the Works Progress Administration, CCCNY, all these organizations right here had provisions for farmers directly added into them. You had the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, in which they sought to reduce livestock herd sizes on submarginal lands and take some grazing lands out of production to conserve the soil. And by and large, most of these were highly successful programs. And so again, it's really going to reorient farmers' relationships away from City Hall and state legislatures to Washington, D.C. Now, there were some other developments in the Great Plains during the New Deal also. So late 1800s, federal governments sought assimilation policies for Native Americans. They abrogated the treaty process in 1871, tried to break up reservations, the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887 and the Burson Bill of 1921. But then what happened is with the Progressive Era and the Merriam Report in 1928, all of this reversed. And so under the New Deal, Roosevelt administration is going to support a return to Native American self-government. He elects John Collier, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who used to be on the All Pueblo Council and the Indian Defense Association, to head these efforts. And they pass what becomes known as the Willard-Hauer Act, which basically formed council governments and got education and some other things under tribal control. So there were some gains for Native Americans here, although there were some losses. So, as part of these some of these livestock reduction programs, like the Taylor Grazing Act, one thing that's going to happen is, like the Navajo, for example, are going to lose, a lot of livestock to these herd callings that the federal government forces on them. So, New Deal actually leaves a very bitter taste in the mouths of some of these tribes. So in addition to that, you also had the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, Johnson-O'Malley Act, and then the Indian Arts and Crafts Board that are also going to be passed. These are going to be, the OIWA was basically the Wheeler-Howard Act for Oklahoma. Johnson-O'Malley, they're trying to help get financial relief to Native Americans, get them medical aid, agricultural assistance, welfare programs. And then, of course, there's the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, and this is what really kind of starts. This was a big thing for the intelligentsia and for artists of this time period. Was trying to find a way to get Indian arts and crafts protected by promoting and preserving traditional arts and crafts. You can go and there's a lot of literature on this as to whether or not they preserve traditional or enforced kind of like their view of what traditional is on Native American artists. But today, there is a very vibrant Native American art scene, if you will. It's getting some great artworks in all sorts of different mediums coming out of Native communities around the United States of America. In fact, the Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City usually has a really good exhibit that you can visit. Now, this is going to end, though, with the Great Depression. After World War II, what will happen is there will be a swing back in the other direction in the termination program as the federal government seeks to end its responsibility in relations with Native American peoples. There were again migrations of people out of the Great Plains to what they viewed as Gilead, the promised land of California. And Dorothea Lange, she gave us a really good visual record of this exodus of farmers and the pain that they were going through leaving their homes, hoping for a better future on their way west. Usually families packing up whatever they could carry in their cars, sometimes heading out by rail, jumping aboard trains. And what the federal government ended up having to do to help with just the mass exodus is establish camps in western lands that could house these folks until they found a place of their own. So here you have this kind of ironic picture right here. So you have the sign saying, "Next time, try the train, relax." And here's these couple farmers that have lost everything they have walking down in front of that advertisement. Now, the federal government did have some experiments, especially with the Resettlement Administration, and this was part of the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act of 1935 and headed by Rexford Tugwell. And 1937 was replaced by the Farm Security Administration under the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenancy Act. This was kind of a back to the land movement. The idea was to take farmers out of like the Great Plains where they were getting slammed by the Dust Bowl, and take them like into the Rocky Mountain region, take them to other parts of the country that the federal government thought farmers could, what they would call reclaim the land or develop on other lands. And so here they would try to create these like perfect, well-planned, organized communities. And there's varying degrees of success at these various farms. But a lot of work's been done historically on this. And it's a pretty interesting program. Now, finally, the big thing for the federal government, and especially in terms of the way that we were interacting with the environment, this human-environment interaction theme, if you will, is reclamation projects in the West. So this was the time period where the federal government tried to use its powers to, reshape the West, take control of processes that they viewed as uncontrollable, usually through what was known as the Bureau of Reclamation. So one of the biggest projects at this time was actually the Hoover Dam. It was originally, the Boulder Dam / Hoover Dam. It was started really in 1931 and completed by February 1935, so 2 years ahead of schedule, and cost $114 million, but utilized PWA labor for it, and just massive project, over 3 million cubic yards of concrete, 726 feet high, 1,244 feet long. Cranked out 2,000 some odd megawatts of power, and it was a symbol of the great deal in the American West and one of the biggest dams for its time period. And it was really kind of this start. The idea was give control to the Colorado River, and then provide water for irrigation, for agriculture in the Imperial Valley of California, and for urban centers of surrounding states. And it was part of it required a compact formed by the various states in that part of the country to find out how to share the water, especially from Lake Mead. And as we can see, for the longest time, the Boulder Dam's been a source of water for the westernmost states, especially California. But today, under the extreme drought conditions that the West has been in for a number of years, even this is proven incapable of keeping up with demand. But these weren't the other only ones either. You had the Bonneville Dam, where they were experimenting. Once again, this one's in. This is one of two major projects in the Columbia River. The other one was Grand Coulee Dam. Both started in 1933. And on some of these dams, what they're doing is they're also experimenting with ways of maintaining nature, if you will, of having these major products with minimal impact on the wildlife. So right here you have a fish ladder, and the idea was to allow salmon to travel up these dams on their spawning runs along the Columbia River, not impact that source of food. Here you have the Grand Coulee Dam, and as you can see, these are all the different projects that are being linked to these reclamation projects just along the Columbia River. And it's not just simply the Columbia River, and it's not just Colorado River either. These are just those three dams, and as you can see, they're massive, massive projects. Just unbelievable in terms of cost and resources. But here's the key right here: is they were all self-liquidating. So they basically all paid for themselves just in, what it provided in terms of economic opportunity, but really here power that's generating, selling that power to customers. That's what's really paying for it. But it wasn't just simply these either. You also had other dams. So like in the Great Plains, you had the Colorado Big Thompson Project. Started in 37 or 38 and finished in the 1950s. You had the Casper Alcova Project in Wyoming, and then the Fort Peck Dam in Montana. So, again, even it's happening in the Great Plains. So for the early 1900s, the Great Plains in the American West were a place of a lot of activity for the federal government. A lot of changes in the land, the way that human beings interacted with the environment. It was a place where human demands on the land in terms of agricultural output led to pretty much a collapse in the ecosystem through the Dust Bowl. We saw in the Great Plains in the American West during this time period projects and policies and political movements that began there for purely agrarian means quickly taking over at the national level. And so the American West played a major role during the New Deal.